So I want to start by reading the first paragraph of my preface about my expectations and objectives when starting this project. So, okay, so because most books and movies that I had read suggested as much, I expected to find that battlefield experiences forced colonial commanders to unlearn what their European military manuals had taught them. Thus, only by utilizing the Indians' tactical methods against them were colonial commanders able to reverse the tide of Indian victories, achieve tactical success against Indian forces, and consequently attain victory. Those of you who have read or seen The Last of the Mohicans may remember that battle scene when the English were betrayed by their Indian guide and led into an ambush. They tried to get into a tight old world formation at the beginning of that battle, of that encounter, in order to offer massed fire, firing by ranks, etc. But the Indians were too quick, they moved around, and they just picked off the English. And eventually, the Indians were defeated by other Indians and by Daniel Day-Lewis, who was an Indianized Englishman, okay? A settler, an English settler who had learned how to fight like an Indian, using individual wit and individual quickness, individual strength, and individual marksmanship, rather than relying on a collective system, on a preordained collective system for the production of massed fire, collective fire. And so this is a very, what you see here in this scene, in that scene, in that movie, in the book, is a very popular and prevalent idea that is referred to as the American way of war or American tactics. Implicit here is the assumption that regular armies cannot cope with guerrillas unless they adopt some of the enemy's tactics. And this image of British forces or British soldiers in America fighting in an outdated fashion that was ill-suited for American conditions has gained even more prominence in American schools and American scholarship since the late 1960s, after the Vietnam War seemingly demonstrated once again the superiority of guerrillas over regular troops. So, so that's the framework, the intellectual framework within which, and historiographical framework within which I was working. So I was really excited about examining this process of military transformation, military Americanization, which I saw as part of the cultural transformation of Englishmen into Americans during the colonial era, before the Revolution. The only problem was that once I started studying the performance of colonial forces, it became clearer and clearer that English soldiery did not improve over time with experience. In fact, a comparison between the first generation of military commanders, who were European veterans, and the supposedly Americanized commanders of the later colonial wars reflects poorly on the latter group, on the, again, later generations of colonial commanders and forces. The colonists' military ordeals in New England in the late 17th and early 18th centuries did not lead to a reevaluation and transformation of their military doctrine. Rather than revitalizing the settlers' military establishments, these episodes highlighted the ongoing degeneration of colonial armed forces. And the book offers kind of details this deteriorating performance. In fact, it was this poor performance of colonial forces in King Philip's War and King William's War that led 18th century colonial magistrates to address the shortcomings of their own military forces through a greater reliance on British forces and on British imperial administrators. Thus, English military achievements in America during the 18th century reflected an increasing degree of British participation, British planning, British military planning, military administration, and military command. In fact, the British Army's tactical victories during the French and Indian War, as well as during the American Revolution, indicate that the British Army was more successful than colonial forces in countering or addressing the challenges of wilderness warfare. So what I found was that militarily, the colonists remained committed to the accepted principles of European warfare: massed deployment, massed fire, and defensive tactics. Their military manuals and training and actions in the field indicate that the colonists did not adopt a new and more offensive philosophy of war, but that over time, lack of funds and lack of training prevented colonial forces from executing this conservative and conventional European military doctrine effectively in battle situations. So it was a lot of fun for me as a historian to be forced out of my preconceptions by the evidence. But the reason why I enjoyed writing this book is that it involved it involved me in a much wider debate between non-military historians. So I approached this as a military history project, but it got me into this much broader debate that crosses virtually all subfields in early American history on this issue of Americanization. You know, some people, you know, like within the field, it's referred to as the exceptionalism question. But American exceptionalism is kind of a loaded term, and so to clarify what we're talking about this question or this suggestion of Americanization, meaning the assumption that the new world was antithetical to the old world, that American conditions were unique and unprecedented, and therefore they created, over time, they created a unique and unprecedented cultural and political reality in North America. Okay, that it gradually transformed these English settlers into something else, into Americans. Now, this belief that America was different from Europe, you know, inferior in some ways, but a model for the future progress of liberty, individualism, and democracy, has been a resilient constant in American culture and American historiography. You know, of course, the idea of American tactics is part of this. The idea that American conditions made European military conventions obsolete, and led to the development of a more individualistic and offensive style of combat. Now, the rise of Atlantic history, you know, which is kind of a challenge to American history or British history or French history, Spanish history, but rather kind of a transnational approach to the Atlantic, or to the Atlantic world. So the rise of Atlantic history has expanded the scope of historical scholarship in a way that's challenging the notion of Americanization. Historians now tend to see the, okay, some historians, I'll say it this way, some colonial historians, I think American historians or historians of the early national period are not part of this development that I'm talking about, or not swinging against the Americanization thesis. But colonial historians, at least some of us, increasingly tend to see these 13 colonies not as something exceptional, but instead of as part of Britain's and Europe's Atlantic empire, you know, as part of the Atlantic world, part of a British civilization, and increasingly, well, okay, some of us see colonial Americans as conventional Englishmen, and when you change your perspective this way, many historians have found that the Atlantic was not a barrier dividing the colonists from their mother country or mother culture, but rather they see it as a bridge. You know, the Atlantic as a bridge that connected the settlers to their families, businesses, news, literature, and including military literature and military culture from the old world. Now, the transmission of European military culture to the periphery of the empire was a typical characteristic of a transatlantic English civilization. When examined within the context of imperial history, the story of warfare, politics, and literature, fashion, and culture in colonial North America reads as a process by which the colonies gravitated towards England's sphere of influence rather than drifting away from it or trying to liberate itself or trying to liberate themselves from it. Thank you.